You've spent years connected to this person. They've always been there, present, supportive, emotionally receptive. No matter your mood or mistake, they responded with calm understanding. You grew used to this emotional sanctuary, the unspoken assurance that you'd be met with compassion every time. And then, out of nowhere, something shifts. No blow-up, no fight, no dramatic exit, just stillness, silence, and a distance you can't explain. They're physically present, sure, but emotionally? It's like they've built a wall overnight. You speak, reach out, search for familiar signals, but you find nothing. The open emotional door you were so accustomed to, it's now sealed shut. No yelling, no blame, just eerie quiet. And what makes this moment genuinely chilling? They aren't mad. They aren't trying to teach you a lesson. This isn't manipulation. Something fundamental has changed in their psychological structure, and you no longer have access. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, explored this exact experience. His discovery? When an empath shuts down, when what Jung described as a psychological shutdown occurs, it's not temporary. There's no reset button, no heartfelt apology, no personal transformation, no passage of time can reopen that door. Why? Because this closure doesn't operate at the level of decision. It's not a choice. It's a primal reaction, a survival response embedded deep in the unconscious. Jung identified this as a protective instinct initiated when the psyche senses emotional access to someone has become existentially dangerous. And it happens most often to empaths, those with deeply permeable emotional boundaries, who make themselves radically available to others. So what causes this irreversible disconnection? Why is it so final? And what happens to both the empath and the person who suddenly finds themselves on the outside? To answer that, we must start with Jung's personal life. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, Jung grew up in a home where psychological turbulence was the norm. His mother, whom he described as having unpredictable dissociative states, would sometimes transform into someone emotionally alien. One day she was nurturing, the next, absent and unreachable. That dichotomy left a lasting impression on Jung. From a young age, he understood what it felt like to lose access to someone emotionally, even when they were still physically present. This experience planted the seed for what would become Jung's lifelong exploration into psychological withdrawal. Later, in his intense collaboration with Sigmund Freud, Jung himself experienced a version of this empathic shutdown. Their relationship was built on deep intellectual and emotional exchange, but by 1913, Jung could no longer maintain it. Not out of resentment, but because something deep inside him, something unconscious, concluded that continued access to Freud was a threat to his psychological development. Jung wrote about this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He described the exact moment his psyche shut Freud out, not as an angry decision, but as an unavoidable turning point. A quiet but firm closing of an inner door he could never force open again, no matter how much he wanted to. This deeply personal moment with Freud became the foundation for Jung's clinical theory of psychological shutdown. He began to see it not as a rare anomaly, but as a consistent pattern, especially in empaths. Over the years, Jung noticed a striking phenomenon. Those who are emotionally generous and deeply sensitive, empaths, tend to keep the doors to their inner world open far longer than others would. They absorb discomfort, tolerate emotional imbalance, and make space for others' needs, ev at great personal cost. Unlike others who might set boundaries or pull away when a relationship becomes strained, empaths persist. They keep showing up, keep giving, keep hoping. But there's a limit. And when the unconscious determines that this openness is causing more harm than good, something irreversible happens. The psyche initiates shutdown. And when that mechanism activates, it doesn't simply close the door, it bolts it permanently. Why is this so extreme? Because for the empath, keeping that door open requires enormous energy. Emotional transparency isn't automatic. It's maintained through continuous internal work. They're constantly monitoring, adjusting, and regulating themselves to stay open and vulnerable. This investment is invisible to others, but it's exhausting. When the cost of maintaining that transparency becomes too high, the system collapses. And shutdown isn't a retreat, it's a last resort. Jung identified 3 primary patterns that trigger this final withdrawal. The first is access without reciprocity. This happens when you are invited into the empath's most vulnerable spaces, given insight into their pain, joy, fears, and history, but offer none of your own in return. The relationship becomes one-sided. The empath opens their soul while you stay guarded. This imbalance might not be visible at first, and empaths often don't recognize it immediately because they're used to giving. But the unconscious keeps score. Over time, the empath's psyche begins to notice the lack of mutual vulnerability, and when the emotional debt grows too large, the empath's internal system declares bankruptcy. The access is revoked, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Jung illustrated this with the case of a woman who had spent over a decade in a friendship where she was always open while her friend remained emotionally unavailable. Though she repeatedly asked for deeper sharing, the friend never reciprocated. One day, during an ordinary conversation, she felt the shift. It was like a door closing inside her chest. Her emotional responsiveness vanished. She felt no urge to share, no connection. Her friend noticed and asked what was wrong, but the woman had no words. It wasn't a decision. It was something deeper, irreversible. That friendship, once rich and intimate, withered soon after. Because without the empath's emotional access, there was nothing left. The second pattern Jung called weaponized access. This occurs when someone gains emotional entry into the empath's vulnerable world and then uses that access to cause harm. Instead of honoring what they've been shown, they exploit it. A confession shared in trust becomes ammunition in an argument. A fear revealed in intimacy is twisted into manipulation. For the empath, who lives with emotional transparency as a default, this kind of betrayal cuts to the core. But here's the disturbing part. Empaths often stay, even after repeated violations. They give the benefit of the doubt, assume it's a misunderstanding, or believe they can fix things with enough communication. They want to believe the other person didn't mean to hurt them, so they try again and again. Jung noted, however, that these efforts rarely succeed. Weaponization tends to escalate, not diminish. And eventually, the psyche says enough. It activates shutdown, not to punish, but to survive. The empath doesn't just become guarded, they become unreachable. One of Jung's patients, a man in his 40s, experienced this in a romantic relationship. He was naturally expressive and emotionally open. His partner, however, used that openness as leverage during conflicts, repeating his fears back to him with venom, turning his confessions into weakness. He tried to explain the damage this caused. She would apologize, but the pattern always repeated. By the time he came to Jung, he was sharing less, not out of choice, but because something inside him had started shutting down. He felt guilty, believing that real love meant staying open. But Jung helped him understand. This wasn't a failure of love. It was a response to threat. His unconscious mind had identified the danger and was protecting him the only way it knew how. Jung gave him a choice. End the relationship consciously now and preserve the ability to love again, or stay and risk a full psychic shutdown that could spill into future relationships. The man stayed, hoping she would change. But within months, he woke up one day feeling nothing. No anger, No love, just flatness. The door had closed. His partner tried everything, tears, promises, affection, but none of it worked. The emotional circuit had been cut permanently. The third pattern that triggers shutdown is what Jung termed access that requires self-abandonment. This is when the empath must betray their own needs, suppress their boundaries, or hide parts of themselves just to maintain the connection. Over time, the cost becomes unbearable. The empath begins to realize the only way to stay emotionally available is to stop being themselves. And eventually, the psyche intervenes to prevent further erosion of the self. Jung documented this third pattern in the case of a young woman in her 20s. Her relationship with her mother was deeply enmeshed. From a young age, she learned that being emotionally honest, expressing anger, setting boundaries, or revealing needs would trigger her mother's distress. So she edited herself. She presented only the parts her mother could handle, abandoning anything that might disrupt their fragile equilibrium. This self-editing became her default. Over time, she could only maintain closeness with her mother by sacrificing authenticity. The relationship demanded a performance, not presence. When she came to Jung, she was exhausted, not just from playing the role, but from the quiet, growing resistance inside her. Her psyche was rebelling. Jung helped her see the toll this pattern was taking. She wasn't just tired. She was at risk of psychological collapse. He warned her, unless she found a way to make space for her full self within the relationship, shutdown was inevitable. She tried. She opened up more, revealed her true emotions, but her mother couldn't handle it. She responded with guilt, meltdowns, withdrawal, and then it happened. One day, the daughter felt nothing. No impulse to please, no drive to explain, no urge to open her inner world. It was gone. The door had closed. Not slammed, not locked in anger, just quietly, permanently shut. Her mother noticed the shift, accused her of being distant, cold, ungrateful. But the daughter couldn't access the emotional energy needed to respond. The shutdown had happened, and with it, the entire emotional foundation of the relationship dissolved. Jung emphasized, in each of these patterns, shutdown is not a conscious decision. It's an unconscious survival protocol. The empath doesn't choose to cut you off. They discover they already have. And that discovery is often as shocking to them as it is to you. So what happens in that exact moment of shutdown? What changes inside the empath's psyche? Jung observed 4 hallmark features. The first is the suddenness. Even when shutdown has been building quietly for months or years, the final moment feels instantaneous. One day the door is open, the next it's sealed. Jung noted this internal shift is often startling for the empath themselves. They may have been struggling for so long, wrestling with guilt, confusion, hope, and then, one morning, they wake up and feel nothing. No desire to fix things, no anger, no longing, just silence. The emotional thread has snapped and it cannot be retied. The second hallmark is the absence of struggle. Before shutdown, there's effort, trying to explain, to understand, to give another chance. But the moment shutdown activates, that energy vanishes. The empath stops fighting for the relationship, not out of spite, but because the well is empty. What once demanded every ounce of emotional effort suddenly requires none. The relationship no longer feels worth saving, and that clarity is both freeing and final. Jung described this as a total energetic withdrawal. All psychic energy that had been invested in maintaining connection is rerouted back into the self. For the person on the other side, it feels like abandonment. But for the empath, it feels like self-preservation. The third feature is the transformation of perception. Before shutdown, the empath sees you through the lens of compassion. They understand your trauma, rationalize your behavior, believe in your potential. But once shutdown occurs, that lens disappears. Suddenly, they see you as you are, not as who you could be. It's like a filter has been removed. The excuses fade, the reality becomes undeniable. The manipulation, selfishness, emotional neglect, all the things they once justified or softened become crystal clear. And once they see you clearly, they cannot unsee. Jung considered this perceptual shift one of the most defining traits of shutdown. The empath no longer looks at you with love or hope. They look at you with neutrality. This change is often deeply unsettling for the person being shut out. They go from being deeply seen and understood to being looked at with distant objectivity. It's not coldness, it's clarity. The empath is no longer projecting warmth onto behavior that hurt them. The fourth and final marker is immunity to manipulation. Before shutdown, empaths are vulnerable to guilt-tripping, emotional appeals, and promises of change. But after shutdown, those tactics lose all power. The empath sees them for what they are, attempts to regain control. And they feel nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not hope. Just calm detachment. Jung described this psychological immunity as the activation of the soul's defense system. The empath's inner world, once porous and responsive, now develops boundaries that cannot be breached. Manipulative strategies, whether conscious or unconscious, simply bounce off. The person being shut out may double down on efforts, pleading, crying, promising change, or expressing deep pain. But the empath remains unmoved.
Not out of cruelty, but because their psyche has reached a point of absolute certainty. For the one locked out, this new reality is bewildering. How can someone who once cared so deeply seem so unaffected? The answer, Jung insisted, lies in the psyche's protective wisdom. It knows when enough is enough. It knows when preservation must outweigh connection. This leads to the typical responses from the person being shut out, responses that only confirm the shutdown's necessity. The first is confusion and repeated attempts at reconnection. They sense the empath withdrawing and try familiar strategies, reaching out, asking what's wrong, referencing the history you shared. But these efforts fall flat. There's no spark of engagement, no emotional flicker in return. Sometimes the empath tries to explain. They say they need space or that something's changed. But they often can't articulate the shift clearly because it wasn't conscious. It was a quiet, internal decision made deep in the psyche, not the mind. The second response is hurt and blame. The shut-out person may accuse the empath of being selfish or cold, of abandoning the relationship. They frame the shutdown as a personal failure, believing that if the empath truly cared, they would fight to stay. But this only confirms what the empath already knows, that the other person doesn't understand the damage they caused, or the cost of staying open. The third stage is bargaining, making promises, swearing they'll change. They say things will be different if they're just given one more chance. But here lies the tragedy. Even genuine change doesn't reverse a shutdown. Because the psyche didn't close the door due to a single behavior, it responded to a cumulative pattern. A survival judgment was made. The door isn't locked with a key, it's sealed by necessity. Jung illustrated this with the case of a woman who had been shut out by her partner after years of emotional volatility and manipulation. After the shutdown, she underwent real transformation therapy, inner work, changed behavior. A year later, she approached her ex, believing the healing had earned her another chance. And though he acknowledged her growth, he felt nothing. No desire, no pull, no opening. The door hadn't been locked because of who she was in a moment.
It had been shut because of who she had been over time. And that long-term damage couldn't be undone by recent change. Jung explained, "This isn't about fairness or forgiveness. It's about the deep workings of the unconscious. Once the psyche withdraws access for survival, it doesn't reopen it just because the external environment improves. The shutdown isn't about the surface. It's about the structure." Then comes the final stage, what Jung called acceptance or destruction. Some people eventually accept they've been shut out. They grieve the loss, learn from the pattern, and move on. But others spiral. They can't let go. They become fixated on reopening the door, escalating their attempts to force access, creating crises, showing up uninvited, bombarding the empath with messages or guilt. Jung warned, these attempts only confirm the need for the shutdown. They reflect the very dynamics that triggered the withdrawal in the first place. The inability to respect boundaries, the need to dominate access regardless of the cost. He worked with a patient who described being psychologically stalked by an ex who refused to accept the shutdown. Jung helped her see that this relentless pursuit wasn't a sign of love, it was evidence of the exact pathology her psyche had shut down to escape. So the painful question remains, is shutdown ever reversible? Jung's answer was stark. No. Once the door has closed at the unconscious level, it doesn't open again through will, apology, or effort. Because it wasn't closed through will in the first place. The empath didn't decide to shut you out. Their psyche did. Jung was asked this countless times by those who shut someone out and wondered if they made a mistake, and by those who had been shut out, desperately hoping for a way back in. And each time, Jung maintained the same position. If the shutdown was genuine, deeply unconscious, and total, there's no reopening it. You can't decide to reverse something that wasn't a decision in the first place. It's like trying to unknow a truth or unfeel a wound that changed who you are. But Jung did offer one nuance. Sometimes what looks like shutdown is actually just emotional withdrawal or boundary setting, not the deep psychic closure he described. In these cases, reconnection may be possible if the triggering behavior changes and the empath consciously chooses to re-engage. So how do we tell the difference? Jung outlined key distinctions. True shutdown comes with a complete absence of emotional resonance. The empath feels no anger, no hope, no pull. There's no emotional charge, just neutrality. Their perception has shifted from empathic to objective. They see you clearly without the lens of compassion, and they no longer respond to manipulation, guilt, or sentimentality. Most importantly, there is no internal desire to reconnect. In contrast, temporary withdrawal still holds emotional energy. There's still pain, frustration, maybe hope. The empath might feel angry or deeply hurt, but they still care. That emotional current means the door is closed, but not sealed. Jung explained that true shutdown is like the psyche hitting a kill switch. It's not about time or change, it's about safety. And sometimes, over many years, without contact, an empath may reach a level of psychological stability where they can interact with the shut-out person. But this isn't a reopening of access. It's cordial detachment. The intimacy, the emotional availability, they never return. At best, it becomes a polite, boundaried relationship. Nothing more. As Jung's theory unfolds, he offers two distinct perspectives, one for each side of the shutdown experience. First, to the empath who has initiated the shutdown. Jung would affirm that your decision, while painful, is not a sign of failure or emotional deficiency. It's not cruelty. It's not a lack of compassion. It's your psyche finally choosing self-preservation over unreciprocated access. You may grieve, grieve the person, the relationship, and even the version of yourself who once could stay open no matter the cost. But Jung insisted that this grief is not weakness. It's the natural mourning of something unsustainable. You gave too much for too long, and now your psyche has done what your conscious mind wouldn't. It has stepped in to save you. The ability to close the door to say enough is not a flaw. It's a sign of emotional maturity. For too long, you tolerated what was intolerable. You stayed when your boundaries were trampled, your needs neglected, your vulnerability used against you. The shutdown isn't the failure. It's the healing. And to those who have been shut out, Jung's message is harder to hear. The shutdown wasn't punishment. It wasn't a sudden rejection. It was the culmination of a pattern your behavior helped create. The empath didn't close the door because of one thing you did. They closed it because of a persistent emotional dynamic that became unsafe for them to endure. This doesn't mean you're broken or beyond redemption, but it does mean that this relationship is over, at least in the way you once knew it. And no amount of transformation will guarantee access again. Jung's advice? Stop trying to force your way back in. Instead, turn inward. Examine the patterns that contributed to the shutdown. Heal, not to win them back, but to ensure you don't repeat the same dynamic with someone else. Jung believed that being shut out by an empath, while often devastating, can become a transformative moment. For many, it's the first time they are truly forced to confront relational patterns they've ignored or denied. As long as the empath remained accessible, change felt unnecessary. But when that access is lost forever, something shifts. The loss becomes a mirror. Jung often saw patients reach profound personal growth only after shutdown forced them to reevaluate their behaviors, attachments, and emotional blind spots. It was the ending they never wanted, but the beginning they truly needed. He wrote, toward the end of his life, something that encapsulates this painful yet powerful truth. The empath's capacity to close the door is not cruelty, it is wisdom. For years, they were an open gate. People walked in and out unaware of the cost. When the door finally closes, it is not to harm it, it is to survive. So if you find yourself locked out, ask not how to reopen the door, but why it had to be closed. Let that insight guide your healing. Let it shape the way you engage with vulnerability in future relationships. Don't seek access, seek understanding. And if you're the one who shut down, trust the clarity of that moment. Don't let guilt convince you to reopen wounds that your psyche sealed for your protection. The fact that it hurt to close the door means you cared deeply. The fact that you kept it closed means you finally cared about yourself. As we bring this exploration to a close, consider this. Psychic shutdown isn't a dramatic exit or a tactic for control. It's not a door slammed in anger. It's one quietly sealed in sorrow. It's the final act of an exhausted psyche choosing self-preservation after every other option has failed. Whether you are the one who closed the door or the one standing on the other side of it, Jung's shutdown theory is not a sentence. It's a signal to reflect, to grow, and most importantly, to honor the limits of what your psyche can sustain. And here's the most vital truth. Some endings aren't tragedies. They're necessary boundaries. They're the start of a new phase, one where the empath is no longer a reservoir to be drained, but a soul allowed to rest. So if this message resonated, if it helped you understand your own experience or someone else's, do something simple but powerful. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your story matters, and there's someone else out there who needs to hear it too.